Good morning, everyone, for a high-level Warsaw conference on nuclear financing, organized by the Nuclear Energy Agency with the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation and the government of Poland. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A Zoom function. For the opening remarks, it's now my pleasure to pass the floor and introduce Under-Secretary of State Adam Żyborski from the government of Poland.
Thank you very much for organizing this discussion with us today. I'm really happy that I can open this high-level conference on nuclear co-financing, which we are co-hosting with the Nuclear Energy Agency and IFNEC. I took part in the kickoff workshop in January this year, and later on we had several meetings with experts from the nuclear industry, from academia, from governments and international organizations that look at these issues around financing, around the possibilities for financing, the options to overcome existing barriers and impediments to the financing of new-built nuclear reactors. And I'm therefore very happy that we can host today's event that concludes these series of webinar, and that we can call it the Warsaw conference. Let me maybe in an introduction say a few words about the Polish and European policy in this respect. I think the 2050 net zero target is a huge challenge for Poland and for the EU as a whole. It's probably the most ambitious policy we've had in a long time in the EU. And for us as Poland, this challenge is particularly difficult given our starting point and the fact that we are currently producing electricity mainly based on coal. As much as 70% of our electricity is still coming from coal today, and we need to plan this transition in a progressive manner so as to ensure that the most coal-dependent regions today, especially those where mining is still happening, can transition to new activities in order to ensure we will take into account the social impacts of that transition. And this transformation will certainly be a difficult one and a lengthy one and challenging, but we are determined as Poland to change gradually our energy mix, to modernize our industry while maintaining the competitiveness of our economy. And in this framework, nuclear power reactors are a crucial element of our efforts to reduce emissions, and we foresee that they will cover about 20% of our energy needs in the future. We have and we see that these needs for nuclear energy are also shared by a number of countries. We've seen that in the discussions we had also during the COP in Glasgow, and we see that very well with the current situation on the energy markets and the rising emissions in markets heavily dependent on fossil fuels to stabilize renewables generation, and therefore here again we see a crucial role for nuclear power in the future, and we see that a growing number of countries is sharing this view, and in order to achieve those plans, there are obviously many challenges, and one of the biggest one is probably not even public acceptance, at least in Poland, but certainly financing. Financing is critical, not only in the investment decision and in the construction process, but also because of its impact on future electricity prices, which again, the situation in the recent months has shown to be important because of its social and economic impact. If we want to ensure a reasonable cost for energy produced from nuclear reactors, then securing an adequate and effective financing is critical to that end. And in this context, I think that implementing nuclear projects in the EU is made more complicated by the fact that we actually lack a real level playing field with other zero emission technologies. And I think that the discussion we see today around taxonomy in the EU clearly reflects that problem. I would hope that we can move to a less politicized discussion and really based on science, take decisions just like reflected by the GRC report in March this year, be able to take a responsible decision that would ensure that we can actually implement those investments that are critical to reach our climate targets. And that's why I'm very happy that as Poland we could join support letters for nuclear energy together with other EU ministers, and most recently in the V4 format last week, when I personally had the occasion with colleagues from the V4 and PACS to sign a joint declaration on this topic. Once again, thank you very much for joining this meeting. Hope that it will be a good and fruitful conclusion of the discussions we've had in the earlier month this year, and looking forward for the rest of the meeting. Thank you.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as we often say in these situations. Let me begin by thanking Undersecretary Giborget Shedrovjasi for his comments. He covered really most of what I think needs to be said at the beginning of this. But let me thank him and his colleagues in Poland for hosting this virtual conference. So welcome to virtual Warsaw for the Warsaw conference. This is the conclusion, as you mentioned, of a series of 6 workshops that have taken place over the course of the year that have been extremely interesting in elucidating various aspects of the financing challenge. Webinars have looked at the financing of SMRs, looked at taxonomies, looked at contractual structures, looked at how to mobilize climate and development financing to meet the Paris Agreement. We have covered a lot of ground over the last year, and we've appreciated working with the government of Poland and also the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation to bring this about. These conversations have been very important and have been held mostly in the lead up to COP26. They were very informative as we went into COP26, but nothing is like going through the exercise of a global conversation about climate as what we saw take place in Glasgow. There were many discussions in the aftermath of the COP26 event, but I think from my perspective, 2 things that have been very clear to me is that more people understand the magnitude and difficulty of the challenge than before. I think that many people, many lay people, many policymakers who really had not looked at the issue in detail I think did not fully appreciate the scope of the changes that would be necessary to meet net zero by 2050. COP26, I think, helped to clarify that for many people. And I think that's essential because it's important for everyone to understand the really unprecedented challenge that the world faces if it's going to be successful in meeting the targets that countries have set for themselves. And as was noted during COP26, the very aggressive, very painful targets that countries have set for themselves will fail to meet the targets that the scientists say are necessary. With the targets that have been announced by countries around the world, emissions will continue to grow approximately 13% by 2030, when the scientists believe they need to shrink by 45%. So clearly, more will need to be done. Another observation I would make in the aftermath of COP26, and this was one that was a bit of a surprise to me, I have to admit. As the Undersecretary noted, many countries seem to have come around to the thought that nuclear power has to play a role in meeting the climate challenge, and that this is something that analysts have seen for quite some time. Not all agree, obviously. There's obviously still debate about this, but when you look at the work of the IPCC, which I think has been guiding all of us in this conversation over the last several years, you can't ignore the fact that as they've looked at 90 different scenarios from respected analysts and organizations from around the world, many different perspectives, many different private organizations, public organizations, 90 pathways that were identified to reach the 1.5 degree scenario. And when you look at those scenarios, you average what they say about nuclear energy. On average, not the peak, but the average of the 90 scenarios states that we would need to see about 1,160 gigawatts of nuclear capacity globally. To give you perspective, there are about 400 now. So that's a pretty significant growth in nuclear power that the scenarios on average believe would be necessary. So it seems quite obvious that nuclear will have to play a large role. I hasten to state, and I say this with every opportunity I have, but that does not mean that every country has to build nuclear power plants. Each country, each national government, each public has the right and responsibility to decide where it wants to get its energy from. But collectively, the numbers tell us that if nuclear doesn't play a role, that meeting the climate challenge will be extremely difficult, if not impossible entirely. So as we look at this, it becomes clear that we have to make a shift. And the shift that I believe that needs to be made is to align our policies and practices with the goals that we have set for ourselves. And collectively, the NEA, the OECD, the IEA, the ITF, years ago, about 5 years ago now, did a joint analysis looking at how many different areas exist in the economies of our member countries that don't align with the climate challenge. And in the area of electricity, that continues to be the case. The markets are not structured to meet the climate challenge. And certainly a major issue is financing, which of course is the subject of today's conversation. The way that financing is slanted, is politicized, to use the Undersecretary's term, makes it extremely difficult to build large nuclear power plants. And we'll see if the small reactors can avoid those same issues. But I suspect we'll see many similar issues as these plants are pursued. And that is because nuclear energy, as we all know, comes with a variety of risk factors that have nothing to do with the technology. They come with political risk from the possibility that projects will not be allowed to go forward or will be interfered in some fashion. Electricity market risks, which are very substantial because in order to pay for these large investments, there has to be some clarity as to what the revenues coming from the electricity market will be. And finally, there's the risk of construction. And that is because in many of the Western countries, the experience in building nuclear facilities has been so limited in recent years that, quite frankly, most of them have forgotten how to build the plants effectively. And that has led to considerable construction risk, which we have seen around the world, in the United States, in Finland, in France. And we believe that while we have learned lessons, there are still risks in building new plants. And if we build new designs, the risks become even bigger because they're first of a kind projects. The only way to manage these risks are with support from government policies to address these risks. And we believe that that is going to be the hallmark of financing in the future. As we go forward in trying to meet this climate challenge, it's clear that we're going to have to work harder to align our policies with the realities of what needs to be done to meet the climate challenge, including providing for policies that are technology neutral, that recognize that we will need all of our technology assets, including nuclear, to meet these objectives, and that these are principles that all of our member countries in the OECD and NEA have stated they believe in, a commitment to open and transparent market principles. And that, I believe, means that these financing policies have to be technology neutral and allow nuclear to play the role that these reference scenarios projected it needs to play. So after a year of discussion, we bring this exercise to a close today, but the conversation will continue, because this is not the beginning of the conversation. This is not the end of the conversation, it really is the beginning of the conversation. And that we expect that the work that has been identified that needs to be done through these conversations over the last year will be translated to various activities at the NEA and other organizations as we go forward. And I'm sure that as we go forward in these conversations, we'll continue to work with the government of Poland, other member countries, and of course, the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation, which is represented here today by its extraordinarily effective chair, Alicia Duncan, who in her day job is the Deputy Assistant Secretary with the U.S. Department of Energy. And I pass the floor to her to hear her comments and thoughts about this subject. Ms. Duncan.
Wow, thank you so much, DG Magwood, for such a fantastic introduction. They get better and better each time. It is always difficult for me to follow your remarks, because basically if I had written mine down, then I'd have to scratch through all but the introduction of my name. So I appreciate your setting the stage, and that set by Undersecretary. First, let me start by saying thank you to all of those who have joined us today. This series has been absolutely phenomenal. I was thinking this morning that we've been talking in IFNEC about financing for more than a decade. I remember a London workshop. I wasn't present, but I remember a London workshop where all sorts of efforts were organized to talk about financing. And here we are more than a decade later having that same discussion. So what does that tell us? Have we made progress? Yes. Is there so much more to do? Absolutely. And so I think part of the challenges that DG Magwood mentioned about the political piece and the construction piece remind us that we need to make sure that we have two things in place. One of them is not only the political support for these projects, but support at a very basic career level, because part of what I see often is we have countries making decisions and governments change, and that often steps us back in the process. And then we have to wait for those things to catch up with each other in order to continue. And so I think when we think about the type of support that nuclear projects and nuclear financing and all discussions related to the classification of nuclear require is that it start from the top and be infiltrated all the way to the, I won't say the bottom because the career folks are not the bottom, but it really needs to be a top-down approach. The second thing I see is when we think about construction risks and the lack of skill sets in various countries, is this is really a time for us to work together. And we know that in regions like Europe, where there are multiple countries who have interest in deploying nuclear projects for the first time, whether it be large or small reactors, there's a huge opportunity for countries to work together and learn together and share best practices with others who have done it many times before. And so I really call on folks to think about the way we think about our global climate solution. We also need to think about the fact that we have to work together globally to share our skill sets so that we can advance together in this nuclear solution. Because we can think about the climate challenge, but we have to think about our basic needs of energy security and national security as well. And so I think that as we start to go into our yet next year of talking about financing, we really need to take a corporate approach. And that means all hands on deck, information shared, and that when we think about issues like EU taxonomy, it's not just an EU issue, and that we're all weighing in and providing support as that classification system is looked at, because it literally will affect us all. And so therefore we need to lend our support to make sure that nuclear is classified and communicated always as a clean and green energy source. I think communication is something that we need to continue to focus on, because part of the challenge that many countries have is the public perception. I know that the NEA has done a lot of work on stakeholder engagement. And when we talk to the countries, a lot of the lift that they have to do is convincing their constituents and citizens that nuclear would help alleviate a lot of the challenges that they're having nationally. And so we must make sure that at the very highest levels that we are communicating with clarity what nuclear energy is, what it isn't, and be very clear about the safety issues that concern many of our citizens around the world. And finally, I would say from the IFNEC perspective, it has been an honor to work with the government of Poland, as well as the NEA on this series. We know that there was supposed to be an in-person meeting, but we're at virtual Warsaw today. We look forward to being able to join you in Warsaw, hopefully next year, to have an in-person financing meeting, as well as to bring these experts that we have assembled here today back for further discussions. I will tell you, while we've taken 10+ years to have this discussion, we don't have 10 more. And so we will need to move swiftly and work together to come up with some solutions that will in fact meet and match the timing of the innovations that we know are taking place in both large and small and micro reactors today. So I look forward to today's discussions. I am so excited about the group of speakers that we have here today. I mean, this is really the cream of the crop, and Undersecretary, you brought them out today. So I'm excited to see what the discussions that will take place today. And again, I thank you for your cooperation and participation.
Thank you very much, Alicia Duncan, Director General Magwood, and Undersecretary Giborge for these opening remarks. We will now move to our first session that will focus on progress with nuclear new build in Central and Eastern Europe and approaches to financing. And this session will be moderated by Yves de Bazay, who is the Director General of Foratom, and I pass the floor to Yves for starting this panel.
Thank you, Michel. Good morning or good afternoon all, depending on where you live and where you are. It is my great honor to moderate this session 2 today, which will deal with progress with nuclear new build in Central and Eastern Europe, and also discuss about financing. It's clear that the value of nuclear is, in my view, something which is demonstrated now at global level, and it was reminded by the different speakers before. Probably COP26 of its first COP was really nuclear is fully back into the conversation, and I can say for me it's a great progress. On the question of sustainability of nuclear, which is one which was raised also before on the question of EU taxonomy, it is I would say for us one of the big main issue we have to deal with today. For us, the sustainability of nuclear is obvious, and it was reminded and demonstrated through the JRC report that was issued last spring, and this confirmed that EU taxonomy is fully that nuclear, is fully compliant with EU taxonomies on the do not significant harm criteria. Then the question is clearly that if we want to have a role for nuclear in the future, we need to make sure that the investments take place. And for that, we are going to talk, so for this panel, a little bit more about the situation in Central and Eastern Europe. But it's clear that the question of financing is also something that comes at EU level at large. In many countries, there will be this issue on how to finance new nuclear. Just to remind that we at Foratom also issued a report on financing and the investment framework that was published last spring. And in a nutshell, we concluded that public-private financing scheme for low-carbon infrastructure are the way forward under the EU so-called Green Deal. Among the findings, there was a question on investment rating and the ability to attract debts for new projects. The question of multiple financing mechanisms which are required to access variety of sources of capital. The question of stable and long-term investment framework for nuclear investments that will also allow a proper distribution and allocation of risk. And then the question comes back again on the question of taxonomy that maybe will be discussed a little bit more with our panelists today. The question also of having a appropriate industrial management framework, because it was also explained before. The question of managing the risk and controlling properly the project is key, and I would say have to be demonstrated at least in Western projects. And then I will leave it here. I'm not going to tell more because I think we need now to take the benefits of our excellent panelists, which will give their national perspective. And also we have the honor to have Mr. Gariba, that we will provide the broader EU perspective. Then we'll have hopefully some time for some Q&As. So without further ado, then I would like to give the floor to Mr. Guy Bourget-Stwensky. Sorry for the pronunciation, I'm sorry. I hope it was not too bad. And who's going to give us an outline on the Polish perspective. So Mr. Guy Bourget, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I made a number of points already in my opening remarks, so I will just focus on a few more information on our nuclear program. Well, actually, in the last workshops, I already presented the main assumptions. So let me just remind for everyone that we have adopted in October last year the Polish nuclear power program, which assumes we will be building 6 units of 1 to 1.5 gigawatt each by 2043, with the first unit being delivered in 2033, and then every other year a new unit. We plan to rely on existing proven third generation technologies, and this direction was confirmed again this year in our national energy policy with an outlook until 2040 that keeps the same assumption for the nuclear part of the transformation of our mix, and provides more details on the shift to a new zero emission energy system, with a huge role as well for renewables in that effort. But since then, we've been working hard on our nuclear project, and we took over as a government on the SPV who was conducting the project, and this whole process and with the governance changes associated was finalized in March this year, when the government acquired a 100% equity stake in this company. And this project company has been working and continuing its work on the permitting part, and we aim to be ready with the environmental impact assessment by the end of the year, and also with site reports for the potential locations that are considered. At the same time, we've started to work on a new legislation to enable and streamline investments activities in the nuclear program. And these all amendments to our legislation have been included in a Nuclear Investment Act, which we are in the process of finalizing within the government. And I anticipate that we would be ready somewhere in the first quarter of next year for the approval by the Council of Ministers. Next year, we also plan to select the technology suppliers. And for that role, we're looking for a potential partner that would present a comprehensive offer covering the technology, the financing, and also taking up a joint responsibility for the project, because we plan to co-invest with our partner and have our partner invest up to 49% equity in the product company, and to share the risk of that investment. And we see that as a really a long-term strategic partnership, because of the nature of the investment, the complexity of this investment, and all the process of the life of the installation. We anticipate that nuclear power plant projects will contribute as well to the development of a new innovative industry in Poland. We estimate that about even as much as 70% of the project's value could be provided by Polish companies, and that this investment project will generate from 25 to 40,000 new jobs for this industry in Poland. So that's in a nutshell on where we are on our program. But happy to hear more also from the other panelists, and also to pick up some questions in the question section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guibourget. And I have one quick question to ask you that basically came into the chat. The question was, what would be your response to nuclear, if nuclear energy was excluded from the EU taxonomy? Looking, for example, at the impact on finance, and how you would structure your project in such a situation.
Well, I think that the report from the GRC this year was was pretty clear about the risk involved with the nuclear activities being comparable basically to other zero emission sources. So I think that there is no real factual or scientific base to take any other decision than to include it in the taxonomy. I've always thought that it was a bit of a weird approach for this taxonomy to proceed in bits and pieces and not to provide a full overview of the technologies that we consider as useful for the transition and as necessary for the transition. I understand that also the political sensitivities around the issue, but I don't think that should deter us from making really fact-based decisions regarding the impact it may have on financing. I think it's difficult to precisely anticipate how much that will impact the investment, but it will certainly be more problematic for private companies involved in the project to facilitate financing for their own involvement in the project. And from that perspective, it will certainly make these investments more complicated, and therefore will put in question our ability as a continent to reach a climate neutral EU by 2050.
Thank you very much. And then I would like to give the floor to Mr. Gariba. Mr. Gariba is the Deputy Director General at DG Energy, European Commission, and currently acting as Acting Director General, by the way. And Mr. Gariba has been took office in July 2020, but beforehand, during his long-standing career, he had a lot of different important positions dealing, for instance, with Euratom Treaty and different things that we'll not detail now. Massimo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves. Good afternoon to everybody. First of all, let me say that it is a pleasure to attend this debate. I think that indeed, the situation is changing, and is changing fast, because there is more and more attention to the fact that the climate goals are becoming urgent and ever more urgent. And in Europe, we have indeed a policy for zero carbon emissions by 2050. But I would say that even more importantly, we have a set of legislative proposals that are going to lead us from here to 2030. And I think that this is there that the capacity to reach the 2050 target will actually be tested. In the EU, we have a lot of nuclear energy, in case people forget it. Last year, it was 26.2%. The nuclear energy produced, the nuclear electricity produced in Europe, and nuclear is the single first energy source in Europe. If you look at the statistics, so whereas that from the EU side, the treaty spells out the freedom of choice of member states in terms of energy choices. The reality is what I said, and there are indeed other considerations that have to be made when choosing energy sources. There is the CO2 free. There is also security of supply, and there is also the capacity of the countries to manage the overall technology. Let me be straight, because in these days, you know, when there is lots of talk about new build, whether it is, let me say, traditional plants of SMRs, nuclear energy has to be operated under the strictest condition of safety, security, and non-proliferation. And this has been our role, let me say, as honest broker from the Commission side, to ensure that these conditions are in place. Now, we have been looking at, you know, what are the needs and what are the projections of member states for a long time. And if I cite the last nuclear illustrative program, the one of 2017, we have calculated that some 400 billion investments are needed for some around 80 gigawatt of new nuclear capacity to be installed by 2050. And this is very much in line with the 2018 scenarios that the Commission did, that showed that by 2050, we have an average between 11 and 15%, if I remember correctly, of nuclear electricity in the mix, the rest being mostly renewables, but on a base which is basically twice as much as we have nowadays. So basically we have 100 gigawatt electric in the EU 27 in nuclear, and we expect that this will be needed. We have an aging fleet. We have a fleet which is more than 30 years old. And if you want to keep it in operation, you need not only to invest like Poland wants to in new plants, but you need to keep also these fleet alive. And this is where also a number of safety considerations have to be clearly kept in mind. Even though you prolong all of our fleet, we don't get to 2050, and this is where the importance of the new build, or as I said, whether it's a traditional new build or whether it is in terms of small modular reactors, becomes an important part of the discussion. Another consideration, and I think if you have in between the lines mentioned it, there are issues that we have in the EU that concerns the supply chain, that concerns the industrial capacity, that go along with the considerations which are needed for the financing alone. And unfortunately, let me say that we all know that the reactors that are under construction in Europe have suffered from these in the past year quite a bit. So the question is, and this is for the government and for the industries, for the industry that want to use these types of technology, is actually to put in place the basic conditions, as I said, in terms of financing and in terms of supply chain that are needed. And there is an horizon which is expanding, because apart from the production of electricity, there are applications that are sought after by a number of municipalities. For example, I was listening to one this morning for applications like district heating to replace coal, or for the production of hydrogen. Now, you have all mentioned taxonomy, so I suppose that I cannot skip this item in this short presentation that I'm doing. It is correct that the Commission, because of the way that the taxonomy regulation has been built, we have at a certain moment felt the need to have a, let me say, deep dive into the technology status, the legal framework, and so on, which was carried out by our in-house scientific body, the Joint Research Center, that last March indeed prepared a report which has been reviewed by two types of experts. We have had this report reviewed by experts on radiation protection and waste management, the so-called Article 31 group, for those of you who know what this is, and experts on environmental impacts in the form of a scientific committee on health, environmental, and emerging risks. Let me say that globally speaking, neither of the two groups has expressed such a position that would imply that nuclear energy cannot be considered in the taxonomy. And this is why the Commission is now working on what is called a complementary delegated act that, as it was said in a communication in April last year, will look at the merits of two sources of energy. One is nuclear energy and the other one is gas. And so we have to see, we are doing a very careful assessment at the moment, and we will have to see for both sources of energy what kind of conditions will have to be considered and whether these conditions are sufficient to be included in such delegated act. Let me say two more things about taxonomy. Taxonomy is what the word says, is a classification system. And it is a classification system which is aimed at the private financing. It is not a system that stops anybody from financing anything from the private sector itself. And least of all, it is supposed to impact on the way that public financing are used in one way or the other. And you are all aware that in a number of nuclear projects that were realized in the EU, also in countries which are not anymore in the EU, the use of public financing and the scrutiny of state aid have been used heavily in that. Let me say also, and that's my last point on taxonomy, and I will conclude, that taxonomy is a dynamic tool. It's not written in stone. The taxonomy regulation is open to review every 3 years, and this may also allow the inclusion of activities that were not initially covered. So whereas it might have been possibly right what Deputy Minister Guy Bourget mentioned, that it would have been possibly better to have an overall picture of all the technology possible, the way that this specific instrument has been designed is slightly different, and so will have to be looked periodically and on its merit. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Yeah, one quick question on taxonomy. I know it's one of the key, probably most important topic where people have in mind today. Do you have any insights on what would be the next steps and when some proposal could be tabled by the Commission?
I think the time in question is a difficult one. My understanding is that there is some commitment to have a solution before the end of the year. So the end of the year is a rather short period, but you know that sometimes in political terms there can be slight variations in the way that things are done. So, but I expect that the Commission will take a position, let me say, pretty soon in this field. This is, by the way, what has been said in our communication in April. So I'm not revealing you, I suppose, any great truth or surprise.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Thomas Heller. So Thomas Heller is a Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Industry and Trade of Czech Republic, and previously served as Director of Nuclear Energy Department for the same ministry. And also in the past, he has served as diplomat for many years. So Mr. Heller, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to everybody, and many thanks to NEA, OECD, and all partners for organizing and for continuous work on all fields, but especially in the field of financing and economics. We really appreciate your work and use your results for our discussion and calibration of our nuclear energy development program. I think it's a clear message from all speakers is that that each country must find its own specific way how to ensure the country's energy security and how to progress to decarbonization efforts and fulfilling our joint targets. Each country has specific climate, geographical, social, and other specifics. So we are really glad that the right of every member state to define its energy mix, its highest value, and it's respected and will be respected. In our case, our state energy policy, our energy concept, anchored by the law, sees nuclear energy as a pillar of energy policy, together with renewables, energy efficiency, and transitionally gas as well, to be realistic and to decarbonize not only power generation but the heat generation as well. We have now 6 units in operation, as mentioned by Deputy Director General Massimo Gariba. Long-term operation, it's the same high priority as the nuclear energy development. So for us, important aspect, and in our state energy policy, there is a program of new build till the mid of century of 3, perhaps 4 new units. However, the new additional unit in Dukovany site, it's now the priority and the first step. And as of the state of the project, we are now few weeks at the edge of the year. The tender for the nuclear technology supplier should be launched with a target date of commercial operation is 2036. I think what's important, the power generation and ensuring energy security is a public interest. The strong role of the state is anchored in our state energy policy as well, especially in the nuclear energy field, and generation adequacy. Our state energy policy has a clear goal of generation adequacy of at least 90% of consumption, but ideally 0 to plus 15. And nuclear energy for us, it's an enabler for lignite coal phase out. So there have been in the Czech Republic, as for the topic today, financing and models, we have undertaken a long and intensive process of analysis of different investor models and financing models in the past. And the goal, the priorities was to have a realistic model which has the highest probability of construction on time and budget, and low price of production of electricity with targeted corridor of 50 to 60 euro per megawatt hour. I would say more than 7 models were analyzed, be it new build by state, by private utilities, with equity of nuclear vendor, a group of investors, Mankala model, etc. And after thorough analysis, SWOT analysis, we came to the result that the optimal model is new build done by ČEZ utility. It's the operator of 6 units with experience in construction operation, or by the state. These discussions, these analyses were then decided 2019, where the investor model was confirmed that ČEZ, especially due to its experience, will be, or its subsidiary will build a project, but the state will, due to a number of market failures, which are repeatedly described in notification decisions and different papers, will be part of the model and will offer an interconnected system of measures to fulfill the targets and goals. I will now describe the model, which is now in consideration, in preparation, with some disclaimer that the notification of state aid aspect is still in run, but I think it's a model which is not a specific Czech way, but which follows the recommendations by OECD, NEA, by IAEA and other international organizations. So first thing is change of law or policy protection, so to ensure the political stability of the project and to shed the risk which are beyond the control of the project owner. So this is an important aspect, while preserving strong incentives for the project owner to for the effective implementation of the project. The second one is due to market distortions, to ensure the adequate rentability of the project, and we plan to have a long-term purchase power agreement. And last but not least, a state loan. It's assumed to cover I would say the part of preparation and the construction of the project, with zero interest during the construction and interest which is above the cost of money for the state. So there will be for state, let's say it's not let's say project which should cause losses, but rather to ensure the level playing field for all low carbon energy sources, and due to no supply and uncertainties on the financial markets, to offer an adequate state loan, and in combination with this purchase power agreement and the third pillar, as described, the target corridor of lower power generation should be reached. About effective allocation of risk, I've spoken. What's important, we plan to have a competitive tender to select the nuclear technology vendor, and the target date is 2024 to have the selection of preferred bidder. And of course, similar as Polish friends, the Czech nuclear industry is robust, employs thousands of people with high value added, with extensive R&D and innovations. So from our point of view, 60-65% of the value of the project could be done by Czech industry, which built, for example, the Temelín power plant for more than 90% and 95% of the work. So this is let's say the aspect. And last but not least, the nuclear energy and its geopolitical aspect, but energy security aspects as well, are narrow connected with the national security interests of the state. So this is, in our discussion, an important aspect as well, from both mentioned sides. So geopolitics, and of course ensuring that the project will be built on time, on budget, and that we can ensure our generation adequacy. Thank you very much. That's just thank you for co-inviting, and looking forward to discussion, and especially the matter of how to design the future markets where the low carbon energy sources will dominate, and how we can remunerate and appreciate the dispatchability, the stability of nuclear energy. This is not least important aspect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tomasz, for this broad overview and very interesting presentation on the current situation in the Czech Republic. And now would like to turn to Hungary, and we have Mr. Pál Kovács, who's a state secretary and is responsible for the PACS 2 project, which is something which is well known, and we've heard a lot about this project. Mr. Kovács was appointed in September 2018, and beforehand he held the position of chairman of the board at PACS nuclear power plants. And I think I would like to now give the floor to Mr. Kovács.
So, dear ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. DG Megwood, Deputy Minister, Mr. Czetwertyński. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. So, governments should pay a serious attention to their vision on the future. Currently, the vision of Europe is debated when speaking about the security of electricity supply, the prices of electricity and natural gas, competitiveness of the European Union. Response to the need to fight against climate change is already answered. However, this answer is also disbalanced, yet missing the nuclear option, the cleanest centralized way of electricity generation that also allows to incorporate renewable energy producing technologies into the European electricity grid. Well, the nature is such that private investors like big returns, and the larger the profit is, the better, which is absolutely normal. In Europe, responsibility for the security of electricity supply stays and would stay for a while with national governments. However, the market design and the overall European regulation is centralized. Currently, security of supply is not yet priced in by the market. Therefore, we are missing some quick load following capacities from the European grid. Our experience from the last decade also shows that the European market design doesn't fit for projects with longer term than 10-15 years. A nuclear project is a 60+ years long-term investment. As our experience shows, in liberalized market, it is nearly impossible to fund the nuclear power plants by private investors. Even though new builds are profitable projects, 10 years pass from the final investment decision to the first revenue. The uncertainty in profit projections often exclude private investors' participation in NPP projects in Europe. Consequently, state intervention on this market seems necessary. Next slide, please. Hungary has an operating nuclear power plant with 4 units of the Russian design with total generating capacity of 2,000 megawatts. The main goal of our new build project is to replace the current generating capacities until the end of this century, by this way ensuring security of supply and low carbon electricity generation for a longer time period. The plant units are VVR 1200 type reactors. 2 of them are on the same site as the current 4 operating units. The total investment is 12.5 billion euros, and we have chosen Turkey project with fixed technical content, fixed quality, fixed price. Next slide, please. The PACS 2 project is a state project with state financing where no market investors are involved. 80%, that means 10 billion euros of the funding is based on a Hungarian-Russian credit facility. The details are publicly available. It is a law. See the details on this slide. The remaining 20% is financed by the Hungarian state. Up to now, more than 400 million euro is invested and repaid by Hungary. A separate company for the project implementation is established. That is the PACS 2 limited project company, what is 100% state-owned. This company is the licensee, so he is responsible for the future operation and for the strictest safety requirements. This company approved the completeness of the delivery by the Russian contractor based on several milestones. In the case if a milestone is reached, the payment procedure may start. The payment trial period starts in 2031 until 2046. The Russian state loan is provided between 2015 up to 2030 and paid back at fixed interest rates. A detailed economic assessment was completed to assess the profitability of the project. Next slide, please. This profitability has been widely and in-depth assessed by both the Hungarian government and also the European Commission. Well, it also required certain time for the assessment. Monte Carlo simulations by the Commission were based on many different parameters. You can see them on the slide. 7–8% internal rate of return for 60 years is quite good for a project, for such a project, and also for an investor. But there are additional advantages besides profit appreciated by a government. Those advantages are: the project contributes to ensuring and improving the security of electricity supply, not only in Hungary, but in the whole region. The stability of the grid in the neighboring markets may not be in compliance what is required in Europe, just having taken into account the January 8 event. I should also say that the Hungarian region was in the past 3 decades 2 times in a kind of neighborhood military zones. It's a war in the neighborhood. So you can have imagination on what is happening regarding stability of the region. GDP growth during construction, regional prosperity for long term are also delivered by the project. The project has decarbonization advantages. It contributes largely to the e-mobility, to hydrogen production, heat generation. It requires high quality jobs. Nuclear R&D and education are also factors that need to be considered and taken into account. As the Commission defined the internal rate of return is 70.35%, so not the 7.88% of back. And the decision was that the project involves state aid, which is compatible with the internal market pursuant to Article 1.7/3/C of the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU. Next slide, please. The Paks 2 nuclear power plant will sell its electricity on purely market terms on the market. There are no state guarantees for the takeover of the electricity produced by the new units. There are no feed-in tariffs, and there is no contract for difference. The Hungarian government considers it profitable and also advantageous to implement this project based on its long-term vision. Profit is important, but not the only factor taken into account for a government decision, as shown on the previous slide. And I hope you can agree with this statement. This is how the financing of the Hungarian project is built up. State financing, no CFD, no feed-in tariff. We will sell the electricity on the market, and we are sure that this electricity will have a high value on the market in the next decades to come, as we have seen the price increase for the electricity last couple of months. And it was and it is a good and rational decision and a good investment of the Hungarian government. So please align your policies and actions with the challenge we face, like we Hungarians are doing with the nuclear way of electricity generation. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kovac. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Cosmin Ghita. Mr. Cosmin Ghita, who is a CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Nuclear Electrica in Romania. With the position he took in September 2017, and across his long career in the energy sector, was also complemented with political work. And he has served as an advisor to the Romanian Prime Minister in 2017. Then Mr. Ghita, Cosmin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves, and congratulations to everyone for putting together this this panel. I'll start by talking a little bit about the Romania's nuclear program, or at least what it concerns our company. And based on the National Integrated and Climate Change Plan, Romania plans to reduce CO2 emissions by 55% until 2030 as compared to the levels of 2005, and reduce its import dependency from 20.8% today to 17.8% in 2030. Also, Romania plans to reduce up to 4.59 gigawatts electric of coal-fired power generation by 2032. So the development of new capacities by 2030 is essential for our energy security. Nuclear energy is included and quite featured strongly in our National Energy and Climate Plan and in all energy strategies of Romania, and is a pillar of decarbonization and energy efficiency. Romania plans to reach its target by developing a strong nuclear program through the refurbishment, life extension of Unit 1 at Cernavoda, that's nearing 30 years in 2026. Developing of new nuclear capacities. We're committed to the CANDU technology that we're operating, and we've been operating for the past 25 years. So we're committed both to constructing large CANDU reactors, but as we move with this decarbonization plan, also expand into small modular reactors as part of as a solution to replace coal plants in the countries and thermal plants. We're also under bid for a detritiation facility to help efficientize our economics on and environmental liability and make a safer environment. And we're also looking at what CANDU can offer very well: medical isotope production with cobalt-60 production, coming into meet isotope requirements in the EU, as we're seeing some of the initial facilities nearing their life end, as clearly mentioned. And we started also looking at clean hydrogen production. We think nuclear is clean, so obviously the hydrogen resulted would be clean as well. We're at a very busy stage. As noted, Romania and the United States initiated on October 9th an intergovernmental agreement on cooperation in the field of nuclear energy projects, which was recently ratified by Parliament. Also, funding support of $7 billion was estimated for the development of the projects in the nuclear field, as well as other fields, through a memorandum signed between the Romanian government and the US Exim Bank. And obviously, these discussions that we're having around financing are very useful, as we're in the process of trying to shape up the best way for our new builds and our nuclear program, come up with an adequate financial package. The current progress of the Cernavoda nuclear power plant CANDU units, I wanted to quickly structure that particular project and walk you through some of these, and then talk to you about how we're looking at financing for these various angles. We're looking at 3 phases. One is a preparatory phase, which was just recently initiated through the capitalization of a project company. This stage is last up to 24 months and aiming at updating the technical project documentation, so to tender for or to go in procurement for the EPC work packages. We're close to starting that phase. We're up and running, and we're starting work on putting together a consortium in that sense. We're looking at the US, as we mentioned, through that agreement, Canada, because we're still committed to Canadian technology, and also have an EU footprint, because we've had a very good collaboration in that sense, and we think that this is there's strong capabilities and actually the biggest challenges that we face with these projects is not necessarily, I think that apart from financing and state aid discussions, these projects will also be a draw on human resources. So we're very keen to utilize the best capabilities available. Stage 2 preliminary works going into EPC planning, and then stage 3 is having an effective construction period, starting construction, which should last 69 to 78 months. And so our plan is to have unit 3 up and running, connected to the grid in 2030. You probably saw on the news a recent teaming agreement with NuScale, which follows an MOU concluded between Nuclear Electrica and NuScale in 2019 regarding the share of know-how and information on SMRs. Also, we were awarded a $1.2 million grant by USTDA in early 2021 and early this year to assess potential SMR deployment sites in Romania. This study is still undergoing. Basically, through the memorandum, NuScale will help will work with Nuclear Electrica in deploying a 6-module, 462 megawatt electric power plant in Romania this decade. And in that sense, we are looking at former coal sites, basically, and that's the solution. Nuclear Electrica will be an operator for this technology, and we aim to try to put together a regional supply chain and have a regional role in terms of preparation on this new and work on this new technology. Now, for Romania, it's clear the nuclear is a must in order to reach decarbonization targets, and Minister Popescu has made this this remark multiple times, as well as our president. And we think this is a very sane choice. It's undebatable. It was a major pillar, load safety, and we already serviced the market through tough times and have proven very good economicity as you look at our stock prices. Yet, you know, we feel that nuclear continues to be rightfully debatable at a policy level. And here, when I talk, I refer to the taxonomy debates. For example, the case of Europe, based on the recent energy policies and strategies that place high emphasis on decarbonization targets and determine a reorientation of the whole European market. Even if nuclear new build is a great part of the solution, it depends entirely on investors' risk assessment, right? And setting the tone is very important, because projects that have a more attractive risk return profile and more state support or EU support, depending how you put it, public funding, i.e., will always be more appealing to investors. So we're all competing for grid space, which is going to make it difficult. Also for national grids, if you don't have an optimal planning. So that's why, for example, we've been a strong supporters of contract for difference as a mechanism for renewables support scheme. Even with nuclear technology that is considered mature as opposite to first of a kind, investment still reduces to the general rule of attractive risk return. So then, if we need to develop nuclear units, we need to send right signals in the market and have a levelized playing field. Because if you're going to have a lot of, say, free money, so to speak, or not free money, but a lot of support through the Just Transition Fund and Fit for 55 and other public funding, obviously you'll attract more investments in different technologies, and you'll not allow you won't have the opportunity to allow member states to determine their optimal energy mix based on their conditions, obviously their local realities, and also on their grid requirements, which is going to make things very difficult. And the nuclear industry is trying to witness an attempt to shift from the entirely state finance and non-nuclear investment projects towards private financing. And I've seen, for example, a lot of interest from the private market into small modular reactors. But in theory, this may seem as a natural solution-seeking mechanism. It's given anyway the magnitude of the capex and the involvement of the state in regulations. I still see an important role for the state in risk mitigating and risk management and risk sharing with investors or financiers in that sense. So the state aid will be still a must for deploying new nuclear units. I think everyone's starting to see the need for it in our future grid, especially as we're relinquishing coal. So not necessarily, and the one thing I wanted is say that the support of the state can take different forms which comply with the EU legislation on state aid, which kind of leads me to the next solution. And it's not necessarily in the form of sheer subsidies, however, but more in the employment of support mechanisms to unlock or support private market. As I was talking earlier about contract for differences or long-term PPAs with pre-financing. These are the type of mechanisms that I think you can have just push the market in that direction. So, for example, in the specific case of the contract for difference mechanism, which is carefully considered by Romania right now for the extension of its nuclear capacity, the strike price accurately describes the verified cost of investment and allows a reasonable level of return on investment to be achieved over a 35-year period. Periodic reviews to adjust the strike price downwards or upwards if the costs turn out to be lower than planned, thus impedes overcompensation. At the same time, it allows for the state to become, more leaner in that sense, and put less burden on the consumer. It focuses on direct marketing of electricity, basically exposing the generator to inherent market risk and obliging it to realize the strike price. So it's a good way forward, and it gives a forward market price derived from the year ahead. So it has very good predictability in the signal of the market and planning. It reduces capital financing and costs and end user price or consumers, but it also creates a level playing field for all carbon investments. For example, as a support mechanism, I'll come back to say, and it guarantees no fixed level of return revenues or a fixed level of profit. Plus, it allows you to kind of direct based on your grid needs different technologies. So it's not the problem with some free green certificates or other types of renewable energy scheme support is basically not being able to control technologies based on your grid requirements or derivation in that sense. And I don't want to necessarily say control, but incentivize and disincentivize. Yeah, I'll leave it to this. Probably there's a lot of questions that will come that will come along, and I thank you very much for having the patience of listening to me.
Thank you very much, Cosmin, for this very comprehensive presentation on Romania and what I would say what is at stake and what are the key levers for the success of new investments. Now I would like to give the floor to Daniel Levica. Daniel is the Chief Operation Officer at Gen Energia, Slovenia. And his previous experiences include working for the European Commission, at the International Atomic Energy Agency, and for the Slovenian government. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yves. Thank you for this kind introduction. First of all, let me thank you for organizing this event and having me the opportunity here to share some light on the nuclear new build in Slovenia. Slovenia is probably one of the smallest countries with developed nuclear programs. We are currently operating one nuclear unit. which basically represents 1/3 of our electricity needs. The other 2/3 are covered by hydro and by coal. This gives us at the moment quite a good energy mix through which we are getting a high level of sustainability and especially security of supply. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just a short introduction of GAIN. GAIN, we are one of 2 state-owned utility companies in Slovenia. We are vertically integrated, meaning that our business model rests on electricity production and getting with our electricity to all the way down to the end customers, to sales. But an important business function that we have is also development and investments. Next slide. Our most important at the moment investment is long-term operation of the existing nuclear power plant. Our existing nuclear power plant is closing its 40 years of original lifespan. Based on the good condition of the power plant, we are expecting it to prolong its lifetime for another 20 years. But what we are seeing as a development of similar design is that some of the power plants have already been prolonged their lifetime for additional 20 years. So meaning that in long term, we are basically looking also for 80 years of operation for the existing power plant. Second investment in the second unit of Krško nuclear power plant. This is our key investment. Then we are completing the chain of hydroelectric power plants on the Sava River. We are replacing gas units at another thermal power plant, but these are mainly just for the ancillary services. And we are heavily investing also in renewables and other sustainable energy sources. Next slide, please. Basically, what we are the question that we always have to answer first is why Krško 2? Why are we working on this nuclear project? Next slide. First of all, we have more than 40 years of positive experience with nuclear. We have a very difficult or a cumbersome corporate structure of the current of our project. So we are basically sharing the nuclear power plant Krško between 2 owners in a 50-50 share. So 50% by Slovenian company and 50% by Croatians. This is historically it was built in this way still in the previous country of Yugoslavia. The nuclear power plant Krško is the operator. The technology was provided at that time by Westinghouse. The construction permit was in 1975, and the power plant was built in 6 years. So first criticality was in 1981. Just recently, we have been celebrating the 40 years of first criticality and the first megawatts from the power plant, because also in 1981 the synchronization was performed. As I already explained, the 40 years of original lifetime is now expiring, and we are prolonging the lifetime for another 20 years. The yearly production of the power plant is in the range of 6 terawatt-hours. We are constantly with improvements and improvements in the production. We are raising the production of the power plant, and the availability factor is also relatively high, so around 97% at the moment. Next slide, please. Some words about project JEK 2 or Krško 2, the milestones. we are at the early stage of the project. So if we divide the project in 6 stages, we have concluded the first stage, namely the preparation and the strategic decision making for the project. This stage was based on the preparing all the strategic decisions, the location survey, overview of the technologies and the vendors for the possible new unit. We have been cooperating heavily with the local community and also informing and raising awareness for the general public in Slovenia and in the region. This stage has ended basically in July 19th, when the government has issued the energy permit for Krško 2 project. Now we are entering the stage 2 with the selection and the validation of the location, and by 2027 we are to draw the final investment decision. In 2033, the operation of Unit 2 is expected to be done. Basically, in 2033, we are also phasing out coal option in Slovenia, so we are coinciding with this phase out. Next slide. Now we'll touch briefly the financial aspects of Krško 2. Can we go to the next slide, please? What I will do, I will do the comparison between the circumstances and financing of the existing unit in 1970s and now in 2020s. We will probably end up, or what we are seeking now is that the construction financing as it was done in 1970s, we will try to replicate something similar also in 2020s. At that time, we were financing the existing unit through private funds with the power utilities. Basically, all the power utilities at that time were jointly putting together the finances for the existing unit, but also the public financing. A combination of both private and public financing was done at that time. What we were using in 1970s was the regulated electricity tariff, something that is being also reconsidered now in many projects. But there were some significant differences between circumstances in 1970s and nowadays. What we were experiencing in 1970s were, and I am old enough to remember those. I was still very young at that time, but nevertheless, poor security of supply in 1970s was a disease. We were having weekly blackouts. What this means is that the public, they had a physical feel, or what was the need for improvement of the electrical system at that time. The electricity at the same time was expensive, but environmental issues were not such a priority. While in 2020s, we have a completely different structure of issues in the electrical system. So now we have a very high environmental issue, which is a priority. So the decarbonization of the electrical system is a high priority. We have a very high security of supply. So this is not an issue at the moment. And what I've put in the presentation is that the electricity was cheap. So maybe we still, as the end users, are experiencing cheap electricity, but with the electricity or the energy crisis that we are experiencing at the moment, and the highs, the peaks of energy prices, this is not going to be the case anymore, in our opinion. So this is going to change. So probably electricity will become more expensive, or the market prices are already high, but the end prices are now being changed. So for the construction financing, we surely are going to manage it again through power utilities and private financing, while the public regulated electricity tariff, this is under question mark, because it is a difficult and a sensitive topic at the moment, and we will need to have a broader consensus through public and also political to gain this source. The last slide, please. So what I will conclude with this simple message, that the progress of nuclear projects depends very much on the nuclear project management and also on financial feasibility of the projects. As mentioned before by my colleagues, the taxonomy regulation and EU framework will play a major role in this respect. I myself, I think that we are very shy in using the stipulations of Euratom Treaty. Euratom Treaty is one of the building parts of the European Union, and it stipulates very clearly that the European institutions are promoters of nuclear energy. Access to affordable financial resources, and of course, in primarily risk-free public financing, will be very important in financing nuclear projects. But this will certainly depend on public and political support. And in my opinion, energy-only market reform is needed. I have heard this from my colleagues before. The current markets, they do not appreciate for security of supply, and nuclear is here a champion in all respects. Financing itself will also improve with nuclear project performance. That this is something that where nuclear industry has to improve in public relations with a higher proactive approach, but also building back supply chains. This is something that for 30 or 40 years without major projects, we are having difficulties of building this back, especially in the Western world, and improve also project record by a replication of nuclear projects. Here, I will stop with my presentation. Of course, I'm open for all kinds of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. There are plenty of questions and basically plenty of things everybody is thinking about in terms of asking, by the way, to all the panelists. I will only ask one last question because we are already running out of time. It's a question that is a little bit more political in a way. It's a question to Tomáš Eller, because Czech Republic is going to take over the EU presidency in 2022 from July onward. And basically on this question of financing and the role of nuclear at large and how to invest in new nuclear, Tomáš, is there any initiative the Czech Republic is intending to take or in that respect during your mandate?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, we have a comfort to have presidency or trial presidency with France and Sweden, 3 nuclear countries with which count on nuclear energy for the future as well. So we will surely have in the trial presidents nuclear energy mentioned and in our program. And what we plan to host European Energy Nuclear Forum in autumn next year, hopefully meeting in person after 2 years break, Then on the nuclear, we will host a set plan conference. There will be a panel dedicated to nuclear energy R&D. We want to highlight a bit more the nuclear energy ecosystem, especially the industry, its value added, its macroeconomic importance, export, and I think the strategical approach of let's say independence and self-sufficiency as well. And yeah, during next year, the EU SMR platform should be established or established earlier, but deliver some results of the first phase. So we are looking forward to align it with our presidency and to use the synergies. So it will be an important issue in the energy chapter, of course, with respect that yeah, there are member states which count with this technology, and of course that there are member states which do not plan to use nuclear. This from today's perspective, but it has to be. I think it's important. We need a true level playing field for all low carbon energy sources. Taxonomy is a first step, but
I'm afraid we lost Thomas Scheller.
Yeah, some technical problem. Yeah, hopefully I was understood and mentioned some concrete plans, and yeah, my thanks to French and Swedish partners, and of course to DG NR and the Commission as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we have reached the end of this panel. Sorry for being so late. So there are a lot of questions which have been put on the chat. Maybe we try to answer those questions and reply in writing. So I don't know how exactly we can structure that, but we'll hand it over anyway to NEA, Michel Berthelemy, and also to other speakers who are coming next. Thank you very much, and thank you. Have a good afternoon or morning for us, depending on where you are.
Well, thank you very, very much, Yves, and to all the panelists for very rich panels that cover a lot of ground. We heard of the critical importance of nuclear to meet climate goals and the progress made in developing and implementing policy in this field in Central and Eastern Europe, and more generally, Europe at large. So let us now turn in more detail at how we can align nuclear financing frameworks with these important decarbonization objectives, which maybe to set the scene essentially means to find the right approach to allocate and mitigate risks between public and private sectors, to align stakeholders' interests to effective project structuring. And to do that, the panel we have now will include experts from a range of background, and will also be the opportunity to start with a presentation from NEA Chief Energy Economics, Jan Kepler, that will provide an overview of some of the work and initial finding considerations we have been developing in this field at NEA over the course of the year, and in parallel of the work we've been doing with IFNEC and the government of Poland. And so without further ado, I will pass on the floor to Jan for a presentation of this work, and then I will invite all our panelists for some initial remarks, and hopefully we have a bit more time for panel discussion afterward to finish on time, 5 p.m. Paris time. So Jan, over to you for your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Michel. It's a real pleasure to be here, both to see this initiative to have come that far. Since the beginning of the year, we have had a number of important and well-attended events in this IFNEC NEA financing initiative with the support of the government of Poland. And as Michelle said, I will share my screen to present indeed the work that we have been doing in the meantime on a bit of a conceptual framework for thinking about the financing of nuclear new build. The paper is, or how should I say, the presentation is called De-risking and Optimizing the Cost of Capital in Financing New Nuclear Power Plants. It's to some extent a continuation of previous work. We had in 2015 a first publication out on nuclear financing. And also the title sort of alludes to the fact that this is what we sometimes call a normative analysis, i.e. what should be the cost of capital in financing a new nuclear power plant. And then governments have, of course, a major role of making this sort of ideal normative value of the cost of capital a reality. It's also a very important point, though, in any discussions with institutions such as the European Commission, i.e. what would be considered a subsidy under certain circumstances, and what should indeed be the cost of capital of a new nuclear power plant. If we can start the presentation, you know all of this. Nuclear is a low carbon electricity provider, indispensable to reach net zero by 2050. That means we need to very much accelerate the rate of construction. Nuclear power plants are large and highly capital intensive. That makes minimizing and optimizing the financing costs a key element in successful nuclear new build. Overall, the costs of nuclear new build depend on the overnight costs. This will not be the topic of our work here. It has been work of NEA work in the past, of course, and in the future, perhaps. We will have some work on the project structure and efficiency of management, but the priority will be on the different components of the cost of capital. You're probably all aware the cost of capital is a function of risk. And thus, if you want to minimize the cost of capital, you need to de-risk the different elements that compose the cost of capital, and that will be key to success. If you can go on. Here we have the LCOE comparisons in the past, just to say nuclear, if managed well, handled well, is a highly competitive source of electricity. LTO, of course, is even more inexpensive or even more competitive than the new build, but even new build, and these are 7% cost of capital, holds its own also against the other low carbon technologies. We can go on here at the beginning rather quickly. This could be indeed the potential contribution of nuclear energy in a context of net zero targets by 2050. This is recent work by the NEA. It was mentioned by DG Magwood, the 1,160 gigawatts that we can reach by 2050, if indeed all the stars are aligned and we get both the long-term, all three, the long-term operation, the new construction of large generation 3 reactors, and the SMR construction underway sufficiently early. Next slide. Yes, now we're getting to the heart of the matter. Here you see the cost of a nuclear power plant in comparison with a coal and with a gas plant in function of the discount rate or in function of the cost of capital. Nuclear is here in yellow, and you clearly see that nuclear is by far the most dependent on the cost of capital. At zero rates, at pure overnight costs, we are around 35. What I showed was at 7%, we were between 60 and 70. And as soon as you're sort of at rates of 10 and above, it gets very, very expensive. So the cost of capital is absolutely decisive for the success of a nuclear new build project. Next slide. basically showing a similar message again. Look at the investment cost here in the middle at 3%, 7%, and 10%. We're going from, in the case of France, just because it's in the first of the list, we're going from $22 per megawatt hour to $73 per megawatt hour. Of course, that then translates itself also into LCOE. Absolutely very, very large differences in the cost of nuclear in functioning of the cost of financing. Next slide. And now we're really coming to the new work of NEA, and there are several points that I would like to mention right from the start. There is a systematic de-risking of the different components of the cost of capital in nuclear financing is necessary. First point. Second point, long-term risk-free rates. The rates that we pay for government debt in the capital markets right now for long-term capital, from long-term debt, for governments with high creditworthiness, often referred to also as a risk-free rate, especially in the case of the United States, are at historic lows and are likely to stay so. They are indeed below zero. We'll come back to that. Third, the correlation of the benefits of low carbon power generation. With the wider market developments, systemic risk is limited, especially if we look at it in terms of a low carbon infrastructure. That makes it very attractive to investors seeking diversification. And finally, there exists a number of project-specific risks that are independent of what's happening in financial markets in general. And they were also mentioned by DG Magwood: political risk, electricity market price risk, and construction price risk. And I will briefly comment on all three of them. Next slide. Then, of course, with the financing, we need to think on the project management, on the project structure. That needs to be decided at the moment of financing. I think there's a very important point, this point 6 already, that the financing structures may change during the lifetime of a nuclear power plant. I do not think that we sort of should decide at the moment of beginning the construction that that sort of composition of the participants in the financing does necessarily need to stay the same during the lifetime of the operation of the plant. In particular, at the moment of commissioning, a nuclear power plant until then has been a high-risk project, mainly due to that considerably high construction risk. It now, at that very moment, when it starts operating, it does become a low-risk project. And sort of the investor profile for the first part does not necessarily need to be the same investor profile for the future after commissioning. Then we also show that if you look at what in previous projects has been the norm, then we see that such de-risking has taken place almost everywhere. Yet there exists no real reference in the literature and no established framework how this de-risking should be done and has been done. And to some extent, our research here at the NEA now tries to provide such a framework, but we feel ourselves very much in continuity with empirical practice, with historical practice, and just try to sort of put that into a somewhat more coherent language. And then it has already been said, even with a shared conceptual framework, history, culture, national industrial structures, country specificities will remain important in nuclear new build, and different countries will choose different arrangements, even if they share the analysis or an analysis comparable to the one that we are proposing here. Next slide. Yes, this looks a little bit forbidding, but take it for its iconic quality. We don't need to do any complicated math here, but we should recall that in the approach that we're using, which is based on a standard approach in financing, the capital asset pricing model, do not need to go into details here, that the cost of capital of a nuclear project, the RN, is a composite. And it's really composed of different parts, of different risks that all go into that cost of capital. The first is a risk-free rate. The rate that governments with very good balance sheets need to pay in the capital markets, the risk-free rate. Then we have the systemic market risk, sort of the general risk in financial markets. If there is a shock, then all the market will go down together or will go up together. Let's say an interest rate shock or something else, which is important, fine. But even more important is the correlation of that nuclear project, the beta N, with that systemic shock. Is a nuclear power plant as an infrastructure against climate change risks, is that really measurable as just another commercial investment? Or does it have some other qualities that make it different from just another standard market-based investment? That's a beta N, and that's a key point. And then ultimately, we have a number of what is called idiosyncratic risks or project-specific risks. These are the ones that were mentioned: political risk, electricity price risk, and construction risk. And the rest of my presentation, and I'll try to make, or will make this as briefly as possible, is indeed all of these elements are or can be reduced very, very low, if not to zero, very, very close to zero. And that should then be the cost of capital of a successful nuclear new build project. Next slide, please. Just two examples for the risk-free rate. Very recently, last week, inflation-protected government bonds in the United States, 30 years. So this is really long-term, sufficiently long for a project in nuclear, was minus 0.52. So this is inflation-protected. So this is locked in. 2 days earlier, the nominal yield, so this is not yet inflation protected, on 30-year obligations of France was plus 85. But given that we have inflation right now at rates which are 2% and higher, this again makes for negative real rates on long-term debt. So much for that. We have to say not all countries have the same rates. There is country risk, and then the risk-free rate needs to be adjusted by the country risk. But nevertheless, these rates are very, very low in capital markets the world over. Let's briefly talk about systemic risk. It's in the literature, it's discussed and so forth. Let's say it's around 3%, 2%, others say that's not our point. Our key point is the beta N, the correlation of nuclear with the overall systemic risk in the market. If we think that the benefits of a nuclear power plant are absolutely in line with general economic growth, then beta N is equal to 1, and we need to account for that. However, if we think that the benefits of a nuclear power plant will remain stable or will even increase as climate change and emission reduction efforts impact negatively economic growth, especially if there's a big shock and all of a sudden overnight we need to move towards net zero, or we see that all fossil fuels need to be stopped immediately or things like that, then the correlation would be 0 or could be even negative. And then a nuclear power plant or another low carbon infrastructure would indeed have a much lower or even a 0 correlation. The question is, how do we consider it? And as soon as we consider low carbon generation as a protective low carbon infrastructure in both political as in private dimension, then indeed the systemic risk is no longer relevant for the cost of capital of nuclear. Let's move on. We'll come to the idiosyncratic risks in the next slide. that is then the other part of the equation. Political risk, very clearly, government controls policy, and government should take on the political risk, and that's done the world over, and it needs to be internalized at that point. Electricity market price risk and construction risk are different. They're not automatically business of government. We currently do have deregulated markets. Very interesting also of the new build projects in Central and Eastern Europe. Very different avenues are chosen. Very different options are chosen. However, I would say, if you really want to go towards net zero and really only want to have low carbon technologies in the market, low carbon technologies with very low variable and marginal costs, that means the deregulated market will no longer be able to finance the investments that we need. And we will be moving towards regulated markets, markets with regulated prices, markets with generalized CFDs, generalized feed-in tariffs, and that for all low carbon technologies, and that would then take care of electricity market price risk. Construction risk, finally, is a big issue, perhaps the biggest one that we are facing. It was mentioned, the experience is not great, at least not in OECD countries. But there is a way to allocate construction risk in a manner that does not impact, or only in a very limited manner, financing costs, and that is risk spreading, i.e. sharing the project-specific risks between a large number of individuals, which either can be electricity consumers, that would get us to a RAB, regulated asset base, or construction work in progress. We'll hear more about this later from other speakers. Or an alternative way would be to spread these risks to taxpayers. And then we're talking about loan guarantees or even direct public financing. Again, I was listening very, very attentively to the presentations made in the previous sessions. Very interesting. And how such risk spreading is indeed pursued to different degrees. I have 2 slides or 3 to conclude. Just a slide quickly on the electricity market price risk. You know that current markets are very volatile, and they will get even more volatile as we increase, in particular, the share of renewables in them. But also with nuclear, markets will get more volatile as the low carbon technologies all have these very low variable costs. So we need then periods with very high prices in order to make up for that. So the deregulated market is not a great way to finance low carbon technologies. And as an example, look at the 3 points here at the bottom, at the average cost of the system and the implied capital cost for a low carbon technology. And that was done by a colleague called Benoît Peluchon. Think about current markets, roughly deregulated markets with some carbon emissions. Then the capital cost of a low carbon technology would be around 9.5%. Keep the same market now with net zero, only decarbonized technologies. Then the capital cost would shoot up because of increased price volatility up to 22%. Regulate that same market, give it a CFD or other, then the capital costs would indeed fall to 3.2%. Those 3.2% are essentially the construction risk. There's no longer any price risk. So you see how market design and cost of capital are very, very closely related. Next slide. Just a quick word on construction risk. Some of you may have heard about the Arrow-Lin theorem, that indeed by risk spreading you can reduce the economic costs of risks such as construction risk, given that they're uncorrelated to systemic risk, that they're really project specific, but construction projects are usually project specific, by the name already says it. So indeed, we can apply that sort of thinking. That risk needs to be uncorrelated with all other risks. That's pretty much a given. And the question is then, is it ratepayers? Is it taxpayers? I think there very much countries will choose different ways and different cultures. Some countries will think ratepayers should do that. In that case, you have to watch out a lot that there's symmetry between costs and benefits, that the ratepayers will not only take the risk, but also get the benefits from taking that risk. Very important point. And for taxpayers, the size of the investments was very, very large sometimes, should not affect public overall borrowing costs. So there need to be some decisions, but of course today is not the day to go into those details. I'll put it all together and then wrap up. In the last slide, long-term risk-free rate is 0 for the most countries, but or for many countries, but needs to be adjusted by relevant country risk premiums. We can, to some extent, neutralize the systemic risk if nuclear energy is part of a defensive, protective, low-carbon infrastructure against climate change impacts. Political risk can and should be internalized through appropriate contracts and indemnification clauses. Electricity price risk can be internalized through appropriate long-term arrangements in regulated markets that provide predictable prices. Construction risk, then, its economic costs can be minimized through risk spreading over either ratepayers and taxpayers. And then put it all together, and this is where we currently are, and which we put up for discussion. The socially optimal cost of capital, the cost of capital that we should strive for of a new nuclear power generation project is equal to the risk-free rate, i.e. 0, plus the appropriate country risk premium. And if all conditions that we have outlined are met, this cost can also be realized in practice. So we have the opportunity to really radically reduce the cost of capital of a new nuclear power plant, and therefore also to reduce radically its overall cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan, for this conceptual framework, this proposal on what should be the right cost of capital if we think about a nuclear power plant as a low carbon infrastructure asset, and for all these equations on your slides. I will now turn to our former NEA and IFNEC colleague, Henri Payer. Henri is currently the head of the Planning and Economic Studies section at IAEA, who of course plays an important role towards supporting embarking nuclear countries, and that also has, together with NEA, been very much present at COP26 in recent weeks. So Henri, we look forward to your perspectives on this important issue.
Thank you, Michel, and thank you to the organizers for inviting the IAEA to this very, very interesting webinar. And just a very small comment on Jan Kepler's presentation, which is of course very solid, and I think the focus of the NEA analysis on the de-risking is really the right way to approach the issues of financing. So let me go through my presentation quickly, because I know we're a little bit pressed in time. So can we have the next slide, please? And the next slide. Yes, thank you. So as Michel was explaining, yes, we are of course working with the newcomer countries, and the IAEA has developed the milestones approach, which identifies the issues of or the challenges of funding and financing nuclear program, and not surprisingly, this is one of the most pressing questions that countries have. And we provide regular updates to member states on various approaches. and mechanism through workshops, dedicated workshops with member states, sometimes technical meetings, coordinated research projects, and other. And I think, as was mentioned by previous speakers, there is no universal solution, of course, but we're able to share experience between member states, and that is very helpful. Next slide, please. So these are a few of the agency's publications and booklets, including the proceedings of the climate change and role of nuclear power conference, which was held in 2019, which had specific sessions and dedicated to the issue of financing. Next slide, please. So on this slide, which was taken from work from my colleague Marco Cometto, who's also a former NEA staff member, we compared different financing mechanism approaches that were put in place for new build projects. So you have the Baraka project in the UAE, Akuyu project in Turkey, Vogel in the US, and the Hinkley Point C project in the UK. And on the left, you have this risk slide or diagram, which shows that basically financing is finding the way to financing is a way of is finding the way to manage all these risks, and in particular the three risks that were highlighted by Jan in his presentation: the political risk, the completion risk or construction risk, and the market risk, the revenue risk. What we see in all the cases that are illustrated here is that there's a strong involvement of the host and the vendor governments, and that's essential in any new build projects. For projects that are taking place in deregulated electricity markets, there needs to be special mechanisms to mitigate market risk, and these could be power purchase agreements or feed-in tariffs or CFDs, as was discussed in the previous session. Also agree with what Jan was saying, that the construction risks are the major challenge in most of the new build projects. And going to the last point that I want to make, climate change and mitigation of CO2 emissions are a key driver for the future development of nuclear. And it is important that access to green or climate financing is possible to scale up nuclear deployment to the level that we need to achieve the climate goals. Next slide, please. So talking now towards the topic, the strong decarbonization objectives, topic of this session. What is the role of nuclear in that transition to net zero? For electricity, beyond electricity, what do the net zero target mean for nuclear power? How can nuclear help displace fossil fuels? All these are key issues for which financing is an enabler of the future investments. Next slide, please. In the previous presentation, and I believe in the introduction today, the NEA presented its projections to 2050. We have slightly lower projections. These are published annually in a publication called Energy, Electricity and Nuclear Power Estimates for the period up to 2050. And I'm sharing with you this year's edition, which was released in September. What we see here is that for the first time in 10 years, it's the first time on a year-to-year basis that we've revised upwards our high case projection. And what we see is what we have in the high case, we see nearly 800 gigawatts of nuclear by 2050. So that's lower than the 1160 gigawatts that were presented by the NEA. These 800 gigawatts are essentially for electricity production, and they include both LTO So there is investment in LTO to realize that, and about 550 gigawatts of new nuclear. That could be 550 projects of 1 gigawatt scale. So it's still a very, very ambitious objective. Also, higher capacity projections can be anticipated if nuclear takes percentage shares of new markets like hydrogen or heat to meet net zero objectives. Next slide, please. So just before COP, we released this publication, Nuclear Energy for a Net Zero World. And what I would like to run very quickly with in my presentation is what do we need to finance in that net zero world as concerned nuclear energy. Next slide, please. What is unusual, I would say, in IAEA publication is this year we had high-level statements from various member states really endorsing the key message that nuclear is essential to reach the net zero goals. So I would say this sets a framework for addressing the issue of the political risk. What we're seeing is this change that politicians are much more vocal about the value of nuclear to reach net zero. Next slide, please. So we have different chapters in that publication, but I would like just to draw your attention to some of the key features. Moving away from fossil fuel and how can nuclear displace those fossil fuel applications. So that there are different of course aspects as was presented, I think, by the Romanian speaker in a previous session. SMRs could replace coal-fired power plants. So there is financing for nuclear to replace coal-fired power plants, but there's also a need for advanced nuclear to replace coal-fired boilers, for example. And for that, we need financing and funding for the demonstration of advanced reactors that can deliver heat and hydrogen. Chapter 3 is about driving energy systems to net zero with nuclear, renewables, and hydrogen. And here, what is very important is that we will need a lot of clean electricity, and therefore we will need to finance a lot of new nuclear power plants to generate that electricity. But also not forget that nuclear can help produce hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen at scale. And there needs to be the financing framework and mechanism to recognize the value of hydrogen produced by nuclear. Next slide, please. We've seen this year a number of extreme weather events that highlight how vulnerable our energy infrastructures are. And so we mustn't forget that financing nuclear and financing the transition to net zero is also about taking care of ensuring the resilience of our energy infrastructures. And there needs to be financing for adaptation measures, including to adapt nuclear power plants to, for example, elevated water temperatures or reduced water for cooling in the future. And of course, nuclear makes sense as an investment for a sustainable transition, provided that the government put in place taxonomies that recognize the value of nuclear, or ESG reporting criteria developed by the private sector that also value nuclear. And there will be more about this in the next by the next speakers. Next slide, please. As Michel said, the IAEA was very present at COP, together with actually a number of other nuclear organizations and industry. But what was also very clear is that there was a high level participation from ministers as well, and we were lucky to have ministers at the events that we organized on our stand, including Secretary of Energy, U.S. Secretary of Energy Granholm. And we also had a panel with experts talking about the enablers of that transition, including the financing, of course. And we had His Excellency Al Hamadi, the CEO of IFNEC, talking about clean energy certificates that the UAE has put in place that recognize the value of nuclear. We had the CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute, Nicoletta Battini from the IMF, about the importance of nuclear in terms of its impact on economic growth, and Fiona Riley, whom we will hear later. Next and last slide, I think, and sorry for taking some time. My conclusions: less than 30 years to reach net zero. All low carbon technologies are needed on a massive scale, and nuclear has unique attributes to play. And we need ambitious new build programs for electricity, and we also need government support to advance, to move advanced reactor technologies to the commercial state. Thank you, and sorry for taking a bit of time.
Thank you, Henri. We will try to catch up. It was a very informative presentation. In particular, it was very good to hear the very strong and clear message of IAEA when it comes to nuclear and climate change. Time being of the essence, I will now transition to Chris Gadomski, who is the lead analyst at Bloomberg Nuclear New Energy Finance. When it comes to nuclear energy, he is one of the foremost experts in this field, has more than 30 years of experience in energy market research. Chris, we look forward to your broad perspective on these important issues.
Oh, thank you very much, Henri. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about nuclear opportunities going forward as a solution to net zero aspirations. I want to start out my short, brief conversation here by congratulating the entire team of Westinghouse, which I understood signed an agreement with Energoatom for a first AP1000 in Ukraine. And I look forward to further clarification regarding their schedule and investment. And I wish them well and the best success in doing that project. So I like to analyze any major infrastructure investment with terms of what I call a STEEP analysis, which looks at the social, technical, economic, environmental, and political issues that surrounds any large investment decision. How does a local community or the nation, for that matter, feel about a nuclear investment, and what are the impact on jobs? What is or are the best solutions for a net zero environment? There's a tremendous amount of interest in deploying extensive amounts of renewables. How is this going to work together with nuclear? And what is the least expensive option? Sometimes we feel that the least expensive option from an economic point of view may not necessarily be the choice that's picked, and not necessarily one that may make the best sense. Environmentally, obviously huge benefits with nuclear. And politically, it's always interesting to see why a decision is being made. And sometimes we throw in water, because water can be a very, very important driver of technology decisions. Nuclear is a capital-intensive project, so appropriate financing is critical, and I think we've covered that in great detail in the last several presentations. And perhaps what I would like to do is to sort of look at other ways, perhaps, of dealing with construction risk. And I think that the the opportunity to eliminate some of the construction by looking at advanced reactors and new technology provides some great opportunities for that. In example, if we can really get to the point where we're have a parallel construction of the innards of a nuclear power plant and on-site construction, perhaps we can reduce the construction time to 3 or 4 years, and by doing so significantly reduce the term of the tenure of the loan to go ahead and do that. And so I would like to talk about some of the issues that are going on in the United States with regards to the introduction of advanced reactors, SMRs, as a solution to applying nuclear to net zero, because it's my assessment that it's going to be a long time before we see any large new reactors built in the United States. Instead, I see a tremendous amount of interest with smaller and advanced reactors going forward. And a large part of this to do is to cope with the large volumes of intermittent renewables and extensive grid investments that are needed in the US. And also the need for some flexible power plants as a backup capacity to the intermittency of renewables. And advanced reactors, small reactors, I think certainly deliver the day on that. And what we see also is decreasing renewable penetration has reduced the load factor for conventional nuclear generation, and the ability of existing plants to recover their fixed costs may be weakened and may lead to earlier decommissioning decisioning or to discourage investments. And this is what we're seeing in the United States. And there has been significant effort taken by some of the state governments to go ahead and provide some sort of financial support to keep existing operatings online and operating. And there is also some talk about recent and pending legislation that will help address this. And to eliminate this increase in uncertainty will send a proper message to prospective investors in new nuclear capacities. So going forward to net zero, a cost-effective, low-carbon system in pursuit of net zero would probably consist in the United States and perhaps in other markets of a sizable share of variable renewables and at least an equal sizable share of dispatchable zero-carbon technologies to nuclear and hydro. So what steps can be taken by countries pursuing nuclear investment? So in the US, there's been a lot of discussion right now about the infrastructure bill that was signed into law a few days ago, maybe 10 days ago now, and also the Build Back Better bill, which is talking about also some support for nuclear. Both bills support nuclear, and it's interesting to see how they will go ahead and do that. The first, the infrastructure bill, is distributing funds through a proposal to distribute funds to an auction process to keep existing plant operators that are financially challenged operating. And it authorizes $6 billion for the fiscal years 2022 to 2026. So in doing so, we are making an effort to keep the existing fleet of nuclear reactors operating and keeping going. The Build Back Better bill in the Senate proposes a production tax credit of 3 cents for power produced by a qualified facility, and that would increase to 15 cents, provide taxpayers satisfy prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. So that's an additional production tax credit of up to 15 cents. That's a significant incentive to keep existing plants operating and perhaps to spur new plants being built. But I don't see that happening for any large plants because of the time frame and expiration of these plants. There is opposition, however, from independent power producers as well as environmentalists to the proposed production tax credit. And there's also opposition from Senator Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema to the bill regarding inflation and social add-ons. So the question about how to keep these reactors online and operating and to provide incentives for new build is still very much up in the air. The next generation nuclear technologies, however, are authorized to the tune of $3.2 billion for fiscal years 2022-27. What this is going to do is to go ahead and provide cash in a public-private type of partnership between industry, the two companies, TerraPower and X Energy, that are developing this, along with DOE support to go ahead and actually commercialize some of these reactors in the next couple of years. So the goal is to have a DOE facility operating a microreactor by 2026 and a small reactor by 2029. And doing so perhaps will sort of eliminate some of the financial challenges of financing some of the large reactors. So several key questions emerge. What is the optimal mix of a nuclear baseball and variable renewables, which are not going to go away from an economic point of view? And what is the best nuclear technology we can put our hands on for reaching CO2 emissions? What are the key policy instruments for creating these frameworks? So here we see in the US some sort of public-private partnership arrangement, production tax credits to go ahead and execute this, and support for advanced technology. So how do we change the narrative so that nuclear is recognized as a necessary part of portfolio to address net zero emissions? In my feeling, the most important thing that the industry can do is by putting economically attractive projects into the ground that soon generate electricity. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this detailed update about perspective in the US when it comes to large or small reactors. I have maybe an immediate follow-up questions for you. We have Vogtle 3 and 4 and well, soon to be commissioned, and we've heard before the importance of risk perception. Also the fact that sometimes we refer to construction risk, but embedded with that is also completion risk. What do you think will be the impact on risk perceptions when Vogtle 3 and 4 will be completed, be it both for large nuclear, but also more broadly new nuclear in the US context?
So if I understand the question, what is going to be the impact of when they complete those projects?
Would you see an impact? Would you see an impact?
When I look at those projects as kind of thank God that they're done and completed and up and running. But I think that those projects were driven by some sort of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. It's taking 15 years to get that, or even longer, to get those projects going. And I think that it's an example of pushing a string as opposed to pulling a string. And what we need to create a technology product, a nuclear product, which utilities are asking and are interested in adding to their generation portfolios that help them achieve their net zero objectives. And so my thinking is that we need to get some advanced reactors in the ground that circumvent some of the financial challenges because they're much smaller, and easier to build because they're built in factories and on site. And so if you eliminate some of the construction risk and technology risk, then we're pursuing some of the goals that Jan talked about as far as reducing the overall risk for investing in nuclear projects.
Thank you. Hopefully we get the opportunity to come back to this theme later on. I will now turn on to William Falk, who is a partner with the law firm Pillsbury, based in Washington. William has a long distinguished career in advising clients internationally for nuclear project, and we look forward to your perspective on this and on how to make nuclear project successful.
Okay, thank you very much. And good morning. It's a pleasure to talk with you as a nuclear lawyer that advises regarding structures in the international nuclear build programs. The purpose of my presentation this morning is to provide a little bit of a different perspective, which is that nuclear finance is one of many different areas of interest for a government. Next slide. So finance is a key legal area of interest. And so because it is one of many different areas of interest, in our experience, financing follows successful projects, and governments, rather than private industry, play a leading role in the new build project as it becomes successful. In other words, another way to think about it is that finance is a necessary condition for the development of a nuclear project, but it also intersects with key areas of interest from nuclear liability to security and other parts of the project. Next slide. As discussed by other panelists today and in prior versions of the IFNEC series, there are many different finance sources, and they include governments, project sponsors, and lenders. Financing can take place in many ways, as shown in the chart to the right, using a combination debt and equity and a combination of public and private financing. Though there is a role for private financing, historically, the leading finance sources for most countries, particularly for new build countries, have been government financed or supported. So in the past decade, we've seen more financing sources coming from utilities, outside investors, and even in some cases, reactor vendors themselves. But ultimately, the governments play an important role. Additionally, we can say that there are new opportunities for small modular reactors because the cost is just lower than a large nuclear power plant, which is typically in the $7 to $12 billion range. Next slide. The key point I wanted to highlight this morning is that, as we've seen over the years in providing legal advice for successful nuclear projects, is that financing follows successful projects. At Pillsbury, our nuclear energy legal group has been involved in the purchase or sale of nearly every U.S. nuclear power plant in the last 50 years, and we provided advice to companies and governments regarding new build nuclear power projects constructed worldwide. If a country wants to develop a successful new build nuclear project, the best way to finance a nuclear project is to have a first-class project foundation that reduces the key project risks. This means working on the new build project's block and tackle components. For example, a well-run procurement for the construction and fueling of nuclear power plants can ensure that the owner and the vendor establish the right relationship, and competition can potentially save billions of dollars right off the top. And so when we think about, well, what is the cost of financing? Well, competition can play an important role in determining what the final cost, if you have an EPC fixed price contract, is going to be. A well-drafted EPC contract drafted by nuclear law experts not only provides a strong legal foundation, but it will also significantly reduce finance costs through thoughtful payment systems. In terms of funding, government finance, and we can define that broadly to include direct financing, bond financing, loan guarantees, and so forth, can be used to efficiently pay construction costs and to reduce funding costs. We also advise having best-in-class managers who have successfully constructed and operated, selecting a first-class vendor with a reference plant complete or nearly complete, excellent warranties, and a willingness to execute. So in other words, what we're looking for is a way to identify what the project risks are, to reduce the risks, to contractually ensure that those risks are protected, and then to follow through with a financing system that is commensurate with that, and that is acceptable to both the utility, to the government, the host government, and to the vendor. Next slide, please. As noted in this slide, there are a number of different finance models, and many of these have been discussed in earlier presentations in the IFNEC series. The key point is that as we look historically, and as we look at projects today, successful new build projects have relied on some form of sovereign state-based modeling finance systems, which is not to say that there's no role for private financing, but generally private financing is more expensive, tougher to control, and focused on shorter term returns than nuclear build programs. While there have been a number of finance models that have been considered, and in some cases like the contract for difference model or RAB used, the key point is to highlight that governments, not private financing institutions, provide the financing foundation for successful new build projects. For example, in some of the new build financing models, the cost of construction is 15 or 20% of the total cost, where the remaining cost can be a risk premium and interest payment. The models that are better designed can save billions of dollars off the top. Ultimately, because nuclear projects meet state objectives, for example, energy and carbon reduction goals, baseload generation, electricity for security of energy supply, and also because they are critical national assets with national security implications. We like to say that nuclear is the province of governments. On the other hand, private financing and experience are important in helping to ensure that the projects are well executed. Last slide, please. Glad to answer questions in our panel session.
Thank you, William, for this very short and sharp remarks that help us catch up a bit some of our time. And so without any transition, I will move on to Fiona, who will be equally effective in keeping a remark short, so we can have maybe 10, 15 minutes for questions. But I do want you to have the time to cover what you have prepared for us today, Fiona. Fiona needs no introduction to IFNEC or NEA webinars. She is a lawyer by training also, and is currently managing director of her own consultancy firm, and is also the co-chair of one of the working group on economics under the Generation 4 International Forum, where we've been working together on some of these issues related to financing, and she will be sharing some of this with us today, along with some of previous work for the government, UK government. Fiona, over to you.
Thanks, Michelle. So as instructed, I will try and keep the comments short and to the point. So first slide, please. I think we need to remember, if we want to bring private finance into our projects, and I'll come on to the role of government in detail, very few investors actually have an established position on nuclear. If you put the IFIs to one side, and we know the World Bank's got its problems with nuclear, which most of us can't understand, but they do, the private investors generally just haven't really thought about it. They've put it in the too difficult box. They've put it in the, why should we even look at this? We've got other projects we can invest in. That's changed. That's changed dramatically in the past couple of years. And some of the work that Michelle was talking about through the Gen 4 Forum, we've done because the finance industry came to us and said, help us to show that we should be investing in nuclear. And that was such a pivotal moment for me. Reputational risk remains a real concern for investors. The nuclear incidents cause problems for them, but those are being dealt with through the ESG assessments. And I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later. But we do have to deal with those reputational risks. But you know what? The nuclear industry has dealt with those for many, many years. It's the safest industry going. We have fewer incidents than other technologies, but nobody talks about that. They talk about the risks, oh, it's horrible. We need to address some of the positives of this industry rather than talking about the negatives all the time. I have a real issue with taxonomies, because taxonomies allow greenwashing and prevent innovation. They influence assessments. They don't take away the need for ESG reporting and the requirements for ESG reporting. So all their influence is on a negative rather than being a positive influence. And I think that's something that we need to address as countries looking to build nuclear power plants and to meet net zero commitments. Above all, public and political support is paramount to underpinning nuclear projects and new nuclear projects. Next slide, please. Michelle asked me to talk about this report, the market framework for financing small nuclear, which was a report drafted, or I drafted with particularly the guys from NARO in 2018. And I was asked by the UK government to put a task force together to look at whether small nuclear was different to large nuclear in terms of being able to attract private finance. The members were made up of consultants, academics, and people from the finance industry. And I think this is a really important point for the nuclear industry. We need to talk to the finance industry because we're really bad at it. We tend to assume they will be there when we need them rather than bringing them into the conversation. The task force also included members from the UK government, from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, who put the group together, but also from Treasury, IPA, and also had support from NARO and other organisations. Next slide, please. Throughout the working groups from that task force, we looked at various financial models, and I've put here the classic models that we've talked about for many, many years through the IAEA, through the NEA, through IFNEC, of the systems that have been developed around the world to bring financing to projects. As Will's just stated, historically, most projects were government financed, and to date, government still has a big role to play, and I'll come on to that. It has both a financial role and another role. We see corporate financing, but only from the biggest utilities who tend to be state-backed. So question whether we can really call it corporate financing. We've got systems like the Mankala system in Finland, the Exceltium system in France. We've got the build, own, operate and decommission options that Russia offered to Turkey and other countries, and we've seen in some other countries from other countries. We've seen loan guarantee schemes in the US and the UK that have not been particularly successful. And then we've had vendor finance with, as Will was talking about, vendors putting some equity into projects, which was successful in countries like the UAE, where I worked with Pillsbury's and some of Will's partners on the project there, but has been unsuccessful going forward because we've seen problems with some of the vendors going into Chapter 11 because of challenges to their financing structures. Next slide, please. So the recommendations from the Bayes report were to produce the market framework for financing nuclear. And the key to all these recommendations, and I'm trying to save time, is government's role is to provide trust and confidence to the market. It has to set up these projects for the private sector to be able to deliver them and to invest in them. Its role is to help de-risk and to eliminate costs. So you need a clear policy framework, you know, clear market framework, and you need different support for the different types in a project development, whether you're trying to develop a technology, like we are in the UK with Rolls-Royce SMR, and the grants that have gone into that project to develop the technology itself, support to develop the manufacturing capability, particularly if you want localization in a particular country, and then the support to the capital projects themselves to deliver the plant, to deliver power to the grid, etc. And that comes in many different forms. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide, Michelle. So the ask of government is policy support for all companies to be well established. And this comes partly from the work we've done through the Gen4 Forum on making nuclear an investable asset class, because if we can't make nuclear an investable asset class, no matter what governments do, we won't be able to access finance. So we've got different elements there. Government needs to be a cornerstone investor at the very minimum for these first of a kind projects, because its role is to bring trust and confidence to the market. So there has to be some money put in. They need to be the insurer of last resort to provide the confidence if things go wrong. Not that I think they will, but there has to be there, and to provide that de-risking for the finance community. The next one was a request that came from the finance community. It's not all up to them. They can't solve a lot of these problems. A lot of the problems have to be solved by governments and from the project companies themselves. They need to be established well, they need to be run well, they need to be ethical, they need to deal with greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, waste, etc., etc. Read the GIF report if you want our details on how you deal with all those issues. We do believe that there's a role for government in producing funding support mechanisms, whether that's CFDs or RABs, as we're seeing in the UK, or through PPAs, as we're seeing in the US. And the final point is governments, whether as a policymaker or an investor, they need to do their own ESG assessments on these projects to make sure they're established well, run well, and therefore can be invested in by the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, for covering 2 reports in 5 minutes. This is an impressive achievement, which means we still have a few minutes for questions. And I will, I was struck by how much all of you focus on the role of government, which we often discuss in quite generic ways, but really going a step further to understand how much it's important to clarify from a very early stage what is the role of government and what is the role of the private sector, and that how much that is a key for success. we discussed a lot during the previous session the EU taxonomy, which is the topic of the day in Europe. When it comes to the UK, the RAB model is on the table. So I will first have a question for you, Fiona, but I will invite a reaction from the other panelists. What do you see as the key merits of the RAB model as it is proposed today in the UK? How much may it actually differ from other RAB models that have been developed for other projects in the past? And what do you see the merits compared to the CFD model, which was a reference with Hinkley Point?
Thanks, Michelle. The government in the UK spent a long time looking at the RAB model. They've looked at what they did to facilitate Thames Tideway Tunnel as a starting point, but they soon realised that building a large sewerage tunnel is rather different to building a nuclear power plant, and you can take some of the benefits of the RAB that was developed for Thames, but you needed to look at the specifics. The legislation that's going through Parliament at the moment is pretty high level, and the devil's in the detail, and the detail will come out of the Secretary of State's assessment of how these projects should be looked at, what needs to be considered. But there has been a lot of work done over the last 3 years on this and what this looks like. The key factors are, we're not quite sure yet when a RAB will be allowed to kick in, as in what stage of the project it will become relevant. But it is generally considered it will definitely cover the construction period. It may also cover part of the development period of a project, so before you reach financial close on a project. The key is the design has to be certain before a RAB can come into play. One of the difference between the RAB that's being developed in the UK and, say, RABs we've seen in the US or other countries is, instead of work being done on a project and then we spend a fortune as the cynics and us on lawyers and accountants going over what's been spent to say, is that justifiable under the RAB scheme, and therefore can the project companies be reimbursed? We're doing it a slightly different way around, which is, what's your cost? You're going to stick to your costs, and if you deviate, you need to explain why you've deviated from the costs, which should reduce the administrative burden of a RAB from some of the traditional RABs we've seen. The biggest benefit is some of the stuff we always talk about, is bringing down the cost of capital, because of that, the impact on the price of the electricity through the cost of capital. Because if we allow RAB to run through part of the development period, and definitely through the construction period, you start repaying financing costs as soon as the RAB kicks in. And therefore you're not accumulating interest and compounding interest, and therefore your overall cost of capital comes down, as I think it was Jan spoke about earlier, bringing down those costs. So I do think it's got huge benefits if we can get it right. There's still some work to be done to finalize it for the first project, but there's huge strides being made in that. The one thing we've not got to forget, and this is why you and I ended up doing that lovely report that was published in September through the Genpol Forum, is the finance community said, even with a RAB, if we don't get ESG sorted, we can't access the money to lend to these projects. So it's part of the solution, it's not the whole solution.
Thank you, Fiona. Any immediate comment from the other panelists on the merit of the RAB and whether that gives you hope on new approaches for financing nuclear?
Sure, I'll agree with Fiona on that, which is that the RAB model certainly has advantages over the CFD model, and it does provide for some attenuation with respect to understanding what the cost of capital is over time and finding ways to reduce that. The key part is really looking back at the kind of what we call the block and tackle. Can you get an EPC contract with a vendor that is able to deliver on time and execute on a fixed price contract with an understanding of what their actual costs are? Looking to make sure that you can manage the project is very, very important. And the financing, if you've got the project set up in a way that would be successful, regardless, then the financing piece is an additive and not something that will restrict or reduce the ability of the project to be successful.
So to be provocative, are you saying the issue is not financing, the issue is to get good projects?
Yes, that's more or less what I'm saying. I'm saying that financing follows the project. If you've got a good project with a good vendor, with good contracts and that type of thing, obviously I'm overstating it because you have to have financing as part of that process. But the reason why the most nuclear projects fail comes from sort of historically comes from the project management or the failure to construct side and not the financing side.
Thank you. And on this comment, I will use my privilege as moderator to point toward the report we published last year on NEA on unlocking construction cost reductions for new nuclear, where we had a deep dive on all these issues and trying to explain how we can move from first of a kind reactors to serial construction and to a situation where the nuclear sector is in a much better position to address some of these construction risks. But I see that Jan's hand is raised.
Yes, I just wanted to sort of say everything that has been said. I think I fully agree with and no problem. But what sort of that presentation, what was designed and what we tried to do is a little bit to have really a 360-degree perspective. And so in that perspective, there's no substitution between getting overnight costs down, which is the report you just referred to, between a PPA or a CFD in order to manage price risk, and between a RAB or between substantive public financing in order to sort of take care of the construction cost risk, or this construction risk. So these things are not substitutive. These are not different options. We need to work on all of these different options in order to get the cost of nuclear new build as far down as possible. And sort of it's not one against the other. It's all of them together. And then once we're sort of d'accord on that, the big question is indeed what's the role of government and what's the role of the private sector? And I mean, contrary to what I said, risk doesn't go away. It's just sort of you're reducing the economic cost of the risk by allocating it to the party that can best manage it, that can best manage it. And in many ways, that seems to be right now at the stage where we are, that seems to be government, or at least also in its role as regulator of the electricity market and so forth. But we must ensure, for instance, that sort of to the extent that the private sector comes in, the private sector delivers real value in the project and not just sort of an add-on. It's nice to have the private sector and then they sort of have their de-risked project, but don't really add to that. So that's a very, very tricky process. And in particular, these are very large sums. So this needs to be approached very, very carefully. And there I would like to add one final thought. As I said in the presentation, there is a huge change in the project structure at the point of commissioning. Once the thing is ready to run and once it produces electricity. And why not sort of think about the private sector? That's the private sector moment. That's a moment where the private sector, with its operational news, with its ability to extract profit from an existing asset in the markets and so forth, that's a moment for the private sector. I think the role of the private sector in the financing of the construction process, of course, private sector will be needed as contractor and so forth, but I don't see the value added during that initial period, but I do see it very much from the date of commissioning onwards.
Turning to Chris and Henri, any comments on what Jan has just said and proposed on revisiting when private sector should be fully mobilized for nuclear projects? And that would be the final questions in order to keep more or less on time. Chris.
You know, I think that the discussion is focused on the wrong problem. The problem is that we do not have many examples of successful nuclear projects that are generating electricity economically. And I think that the best way to deal and solve that problem is what's happening in the US right now, in that we have a partnership between the government and private capital, private vendors, to go ahead and develop some advanced technologies that will be much smaller and provide much less of a burden to the financial community, because we're going to eliminate the technical risk, construction risks, and you know, if you lose $2 billion, okay, fine, you've had a bad day, but if you lose 20 or 30 billion dollars, you cause a lot of problems. So I think that shrinking the problem provides a lot of advantages and eliminates some of the headaches and challenges. You know, I was told that in visiting the UAE facility, meeting some of the representative for some of the African nations over there, and they said they're dying to get their hands on a small modular reactor. And I think that once there's a small modular reactor operating, generating electricity inexpensively, all of these financial issues will be resolved, because we'll have buy-in from the host countries and from the vendors. And in fact, that this technology works and it's effective, and it's a very good solution to complement the deployment of renewables throughout the world to deal with net zero.
Okay, just a very short comment. Well, I agree with Chris that we need also to develop the more, you know, the other options, the advanced reactors, more modular reactors. But I just don't think that that's the only solution. We will also need large reactors, and there are countries that have been able to build large reactors, large Gen 3 reactors successfully. You mentioned Baraka project. Korea seem to have built those plants really in, you know, to budget and on time. So I think we need good technology for SMRs and advanced reactors. This is I would say still unproven technology. So that's where we also need a role for governments to help through public-private partnerships to help move the technology through demonstration to the first prototypes, and then to the full commercialization.
Thank you, Ori, and well, thank you to all panelists. Our time is up. We covered a lot of ground. I think it was very useful to start with this more conceptual approach, and then to really go and look at what makes nuclear projects successful, and really not losing sight that indeed they're important, challenging with financing, but that if you have a good project structure in terms of technology, in terms of industry, in terms of supply chain capability, it really puts you in a much different position to address these challenges, and we will try to reflect on this consideration as we advance our work at NEA in this field. So with that, I will now turn to Zbigniew Kubacki from Vodon and to our head of division, Dan Cameron, for a few concluding words to close this event. Zbigniew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michel. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guest, participant, on the behalf of the Minister Adam Kiburze-Czetwertyński, who unfortunately had to go to the Parliament, and on the behalf of the Ministry of Climate and Environment of Poland, I would like to thank you. First of all, our partners in this initiative, namely Director General William Magwood and Nuclear Energy Team. I would like to thank the Chair of IFNEC, Alicia Duncan, and IFNEC staff for organizing today's conference and the whole series of excellent webinars on innovating financing of nuclear new projects. I would like to thank now our distinguished panelists who shared today their valuable insights on such complex issue like nuclear financing. We were very happy to hear that nuclear projects in Central and Eastern Europe are well on track despite the challenges we faced. Central and Eastern Europe is to a large extent a very unique region in the world, where the majority of countries are pro-nuclear and they want to develop nuclear power to transform their energy mix to reach net zero goals. I would like to reiterate it is important to share our lesson learned from development of nuclear projects, especially on their financing, although each country case is quite unique in this respect. We could hear from the Minister Gieburze-Czetwertyński presentation that Poland is progressing its nuclear power program and works on the business and financial models currently. But we can say that we have gathered valuable lessons learned from the countries and with advanced nuclear power programs, which you can hear today. We aim to implement financial model in Poland, which will best fit for Polish market condition, investment uncertainties, and to be in line with the EU state aid rules and regulations. Government interested in nuclear power should jointly and individually work towards overcoming the current barriers hindering the development of nuclear power and actively engage in the project development and its execution. Vast majority of nuclear projects are currently supported by governments in order to lower the risk and capital costs and thus achieve low electricity production costs. We also need to continue to strive towards and support extension of applicability of nuclear power beyond the pure electricity generation for end users, also support production and heat generation for nuclear power plants to improve their competitiveness and bankability. Financing of nuclear projects from multilateral development banks and other international financial institutions, climate funds, should be made available on equal footing with other low emission technology. And we are working on that, among others, in IFNEC activities. We must not forget that nuclear new build is indispensable part of the climate change mitigation efforts to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emission by the year 2050. Concluding my remarks, I would like to thank again the Nuclear Energy Agency, which prepared and presented for our conference a special background paper by Jan Kepler's on a new perspective for financing nuclear new build, under the title Optimizing Cost of Capital and Project Structures in the Financing of Nuclear Power Plants, which contains deep analysis on the cost of capital and its influence on nuclear power projects. I am sure that this paper will be an important voice of international community in a debate on how to properly evaluate the social costs of capital for nuclear investment, which is a base for practical evaluation of the cost of the government funding. As the publication of the full nuclear report on financing of nuclear new build is expected in the spring 2022, in a couple of months. On that occasion, Poland, and we would like to organize one more event in Warsaw, hopefully in person, to conclude finally this initiative, having the publications, presented the publication, inviting the broader scope of the stakeholders. It would be for us it would be great opportunity for summarizing the whole project, during which 5 sessions allowed experts for nuclear industry, academia, representative of governments and international organizations explore the possibility and option to overcome existing barriers and impediments to the financing of nuclear new build. So let's hopefully we can meet in Warsaw in person somewhere, in the late spring. I would like finally thank all for the attention and participation in this high-level Warsaw Conference on Nuclear Financing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zbigniew, and thank you, everyone. My name is Deanne Cameron. It is my pleasure as the final speaker and spokesperson of the Nuclear Energy Agency to bring this event to a close with just 1 or 2 minutes of remarks. This event concludes our series of 6 webinars by the NEA with IFNEC on financing, which began in January of 2021 and included dynamic discussions on SMR, taxonomies, ESG, contractual structures, and mobilizing climate and development financing to meet climate change objectives. I'd like to thank our hosts today, the government of Poland, and all of our distinguished panelists who contributed to a very dynamic discussion, bringing together insights and expertise from many perspectives: governments, policymakers, utilities, decision makers, the financial community, industry, and even some perspectives from academia. Thank you also to our audience and our many partners who have participated in the series of discussions and webinars. Very briefly, I'd like to bring this back to the climate change context. I'd like to note, in particular, some of the key findings from recent work that we released at the Nuclear Energy Agency when we were at COP26 in Glasgow the week before last. It's new analysis on the role of nuclear energy in meeting emissions reductions targets. And it is based on a review of over 90 pathways for the 1.5 degree scenario. On reviewing these 90 pathways that show us how we can get from where we are today to where we need to be in 2050, we find that on average, the average role of nuclear energy in those pathways is to reach 1,160 gigawatts of nuclear global installed capacity by 2050. That's nearly a tripling of current global installed nuclear capacity. And when we first saw that number, our hearts sank. We thought it sounded, frankly, unachievable. We switched gears and we started to do a bottom-up analysis. We ran a number of different assumptions and scenarios, trying to project the minimum and maximum ambition scenarios for long-term operations of existing fleets, for Generation 3 new builds, for SMR new builds, and for non-power applications, heat and hydrogen. And our analysis in the end did demonstrate that it is possible to meet that target of 1,160 gigawatts of global installed capacity. However, and to displace 87 gigatons of carbon dioxide in doing so between 2020 and 2050. However, this target is only achievable if countries around the world change current plans from minimum ambition to maximum ambition on nuclear, touching on LTO, that's long-term operations, as well as large-scale new builds, as well as SMRs and heat, and possibly also hydrogen. It also requires policymakers and decision makers to ensure the enabling conditions for success are in place. Which brings me to today's topic and my last few remarks here. Beyond technical feasibility, there are several other conditions for success, and amongst the top 2 conditions for success are the enabling frameworks. That includes policy frameworks, regulatory frameworks, and financing frameworks. And the second, I would say, is public confidence. But there's a relationship between public confidence and the enabling frameworks, so we must tackle these together. So just to conclude, I wanted to emphasize the importance of the conversations we've been having through this series because it is essential for success of nuclear projects, and nuclear projects are essential for success of climate change ambitions. This has been a great example of what we can achieve through collaboration between the NEA, IFNEC, external partners, bringing together real-world challenges and expertise with theory and analysis to chart a path for a successful future. And we look forward to continuing these types of collaborations in 2022. At home, at my home base, the NEA, under our program of work, we will publish a report on nuclear financing in 2022 that will expand on the framework that Jan Kepler, our chief economist, set out today, and will be further elaborated and informed by the webinar series and the discussions during this event. Thank you so much. That concludes our event.